title as much as the title, The Rise of Secular Americans. I'd like to keep it, I'll gladly give a little lecture about it, but certainly some back and forth. If you want to interrupt me with questions or anything like that, don't hesitate to. Is it all right if I sit down? It's a small enough crowd. I'd stand up if you'd like. But basically, Non-Believer Nation is a book about the culture wars. It's about the rise of the religious right, the historical background of most of the hot-button culture war issues that we're familiar with, from Under God and the Pledge to prayer in schools and creationism, all that. So it's got a lot of historical background about the rise of the religious right, and also, very importantly, the opposition to the religious right. We don't talk so much in discussions about the opposition to the religious right, but the Non-Believer Nation spent some time talking about that. And then also, very importantly, the secular movement, the modern secular movement, as a new kind of opposition to the religious right. Okay, so think of that. There's the religious right, there's the opposition to it, and then there's the modern secular movement as a new kind of opposition to the religious right. Now you could ask, why do we need a new kind of opposition to the religious right? And I would just say, well, that's kind of obvious, because the traditional opposition to the religious right has been a dismal failure. For 20, 30 years, let's date the religious right to Jerry Falwell around 1980, when he helped get Ronald Reagan elected through the moral majority. Since 1979, 1980, when the moral majority first came on the scene, the religious right, through various entities, has really grown stronger and stronger. It's experienced very few setbacks, if you think about it, and its agenda has gotten bolder and bolder. What that really tells us is that the opposition historically to the religious right has been a failure, and I think we need to face that. It's just the reality on the ground. So what that's meant to America is really that public policy has been decimated. Any area of public policy, you name it, has been affected directly or indirectly by the religious right. You could talk about politics with creationist candidates running for high office in the 21st century. As I point out in the book, 100 years ago, Woodrow Wilson in 1912 was elected president. And to paraphrase what Woodrow Wilson said about creationism, he says, well, in this modern age, we're talking 1912 now, nobody with any mind, any sense of rationality would reject evolution. He was saying that 100 years ago. Now here we are 100 years later with people like Rick Santorum, and I don't know if Santorum rejects evolution, but certainly Rick Perry does, Michelle Bachmann, Sarah Palin. You know, these people are very close to the highest office in the land, and they're 100 years after Wilson, openly, proudly rejecting evolution. So, and of course, education policy, environmental policy, social policy. There's really not an area that's not affected by the prominence of religious conservatism and fundamentalism in the public arena. And I think worst of all, really, beyond all those things, is just the general sense of anti-intellectualism, which seems to follow the religious right everywhere it goes. If you look at public affairs in America today, you know, politicians are proudly anti-intellectual.
Yes.
They scoff at elites, you know, as if going to an Ivy League college is something to be embarrassed about, and that George W. Bush would mispronounce his words, and his popularity would go up. It seems the most important thing about electing a president is who you'd rather have a beer with in this country, and that's really speaks volumes, and I think a lot of this anti-intellectualism can be attributed to the religious right and what it brings to the dialogue, really. So, that's the way it is right now, but how do we get here? Who or what was the main opposition to the religious right traditionally, the 80s and the 90s? If you look at it carefully, there's really two sectors that most strongly oppose the religious right. That would be liberal and moderate politicians, for example, such as Ted Kennedy, Bill Clinton, whatnot. They were on the other side of the aisle from those social conservatives. And then there were also advocacy groups like People for the American Way, the ACLU, of course, Americans United for Separation of Church and State. If you look at this opposition to the religious right, though, what you find is that although they fought valiantly and they did what they thought was right, there was no sense that the religious foundation of the religious right needed to be challenged. In fact, they took careful steps not to do that. And there was certainly no sense that the validity of a non-religious, non-theistic worldview should be defended ardently. That's not what those politicians did, and that's not what those advocacy groups did. Instead, they did quite the opposite. The advocacy groups, like People for the American Way and Americans United, were very careful to associate themselves with religion when they could. They would appoint religious leaders to their boards. Americans United, of course, has the Reverend Barry Lynn as their executive director, and he has for a couple decades now. And you can understand the reasoning behind that, but what we need to take note of is that they were associating themselves with religion very carefully. And of course the politicians did so even more, okay? Ted Kennedy gave a speech shortly after the religious right first came on the scene in the early 80s. And in this speech he talked about how he loved his country and he cherished his faith. You know, thanks Ted, you know, standing up for secular Americans. But of course he's putting himself out there as, I'm religious too. The moral majority does not have a monopoly on religion, and liberals and moderates can be religious too. Now, of course that's true. It's very true. But if that's the only argument being made by the opposition to the religious right, if everyone opposing the religious right at a visible level anyway is making that we're religious too, you don't have a monopoly on religion argument, where does that leave secular Americans? Well, essentially what they're doing is they too, the opposition, is exalting religion and marginalizing secularity. They're making it not really acceptable to be out there as secular and non-religious and non-theistic. That was the environment that they helped create. Unwittingly, I'd say. I don't think these politicians and these groups were out to get the secular community. I think they were just fighting like heck to oppose this social phenomenon of religious conservatism that was taking over the country. But
and at that time,
yeah,
it was, everything indicated that those with faith were clearly in the majority, so that if what you wanted to appeal to was the majority, you had to appeal to people with faith.
Right, and it's worth pointing out that even atheists back in these days were usually pretty coy about standing up as atheists. They would, and this even predates the religious right. If you look before the religious right, all the way back to John Dewey, who's sometimes referred to as America's most important philosopher. That's debatable, but certainly one of America's most important philosophers. Back in the early 20th century, he was as non-theistic as anyone in this room, certainly. Yet, he avoided the word atheist, and he, in his most popular religious work, A Common Faith, was very ardent about using theistic language. He used the word God, not in a supernatural sense in any way at all, but he would cloak his non-theism in theistic language, and of course that also helped create an environment that was very fertile for a sense of unanimity about the God issue. If nobody was really standing up openly as an atheist, as rejecting theism, then there was a sense of unanimity, a false sense of unanimity too, because there's always been quite a few non-believers out there. So that was the reality for at least 2 decades, the primary opposition of the religious right taking this strategy. And I think we can see in hindsight the failure. It certainly did not slow down the juggernaut of the religious right. In fact, by 1980, we were electing George W. Bush, who was the most proudly, not just loyal to the religious right, but a member of it, really, according to his own. He embraced them, and he had weekly telephone conferences with them to talk policy, and it was really a terrible situation to be in from a standpoint of a secular American. So, you can imagine with that background, what's different about the modern secular movement and about this new opposition to the religious right, what I like to call. The modern secular movement does not oppose the religious right in the traditional sense at all. What it does instead is it's led by people who have been traditionally marginalized and left out of the loop by the posturing that's been done previously. Secular Americans who are not impressed by claims of religiosity and who challenge claims of religiosity as being the basis of public policy. I like to think of the modern secular movement as an identity-oriented movement that emphasizes the concept of coming out, somewhat like the LGBT movement did. I would point out that the LGBT movement, the gay rights movement, is the one, and I would say probably the only major area where the religious right truly failed over the last 30 years, if you think about it. The gay rights movement has made remarkable progress, even though the religious right has been on the upswing and getting stronger and stronger. I'm old enough to remember the 1970s, and I know before the religious right, if you were in the 1970s looking forward, you never would have imagined gay people being able to get married in this country. It would have been unthinkable. But here we are, you know, a few decades later, and they are, and there's real talk of equality. And I think most people have a general sense that, that it's the right thing to do. So how did they do it? They did it through identity-oriented activism by emphasizing the concept of coming out and being visible. Some more militant than others, some very gently so, and some out in the streets, you know, shaking the fist. But I think everyone has to find their own comfort zone. But the general idea that we should let our friends and neighbors and co-workers know that we're here, that we're decent, that we're not going to hurt anyone, and that it's wrong to discriminate against us, that it's just wrong to have a prejudice against a class of people that really don't deserve it. In fact, if you look at the statistics, and this is something I go over in the book, is that statistically, social ills do not follow secularity around. If anything, they follow religiosity around. Social ills such as violent crime, STDs, divorce rates, you name it, teen pregnancy, all of these social ills, if you want to call them that, are more prevalent in religious societies than they are in secular societies. And this is very interesting because it's the case internally within the United States when you compare more secular states to more religious states. And it's also the case internationally when you compare the religious United States to more secular developed countries such as Western Europe. It's across the board. It's consistent. It's not like I had to cherry pick statistics. It's just overwhelmingly so. Now, I've been approached, and I've talked about this in the book as well, is that, well, people on the religious side will say, well, that doesn't mean correlation does not equal cause. In other words, that does not mean that religion causes social ills. And I would agree on that. I think it's an argument to be made, and but we don't need to make that argument that religion causes social ills. We're not trying to argue superiority, at least on a public policy level. We're just trying to argue equality. What this strong correlation does certainly mean is that secularity does not cause social ills, okay? We can debate whether religiosity does, since the statistics are so overwhelming, but certainly there's no way that you can argue that secularity causes social ills. So.
I wonder, has anybody heard whether the shooter out in Colorado was a religious person?
The only thing about that I've heard is that he did come from a church-going family, but I also read somewhere that he was a very advancedly educated science student.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
So,
he's very bright. He's clearly,
yeah.
you know, this is a pattern that happens over and over and over and over again. He's clearly mentally ill.
Right.
His family gets him help. He gets hospitalized. He gets on his meds. He's okay. You can't keep him. You can't force medication if somebody isn't under the criminal justice system. So then he goes home. He doesn't want his meds. He decompensates. I mean, this is unfortunate. I mean, it's tragic. But in lesser degrees, it happens thousands of times a day in every major city and in every, it's just, well,
It does.
Oh,
So
Right.
whether he was religious or not, he's clearly mentally ill and he's going to fry for it.
Yeah.
I think the mental illness angle is key, really, because I don't think it's a good idea to go rushing to try to hang it on religion if it's not an obvious factor. But you know, the reality is, though, that generally speaking, social ills are not following our demographic around the country. If anything, they're following other. Obviously, we have higher rates of education and lower rates of all those other problems. So the point is that secularity and being secular is not anything to be ashamed of. It's not something that should be scorned by society generally. You've probably heard the statistics that over 90% of the scientists in the National Academies of Sciences identify as non-believers at some level or another. This is not a segment of society that should be marginalized and on the fringes. We should certainly be near the center of public policy. And my point is that because the debate traditionally in America has been between religious conservatives on one end of the spectrum and religious liberals on the other, with secular Americans not even really in the debate, not even at the table. Because of that, the center of gravity is very much on the side of religion. I mean, even the opposition to the religious right is religious. If secular Americans can earn their place at the table so that the spectrum more appropriately reflects the true demographic of the country, where there are certainly a large segment of the population is secular, that moves the center of gravity away from the religious right, and it certainly pulls out their pedestal of moral superiority. If everyone on the spectrum is relying on religion for their moral uprightness, then that certainly gives the most ardently religious, the religious conservatives, a lot of stature. But if there's a segment of the spectrum that completely rejects religion as a basis for morality, it says, you know, morality is a secular, naturalistic concept. It exists in you know, most intelligent animals. It's not something that you need Jesus or any other revelation-based religion to have. That really pulls the rug out from the religious right. And I would suggest that if secular Americans can earn their place at the table, if we can have a successful identity-oriented movement that demands equality, that demands respect, we necessarily return the religious right at least to their pre-Reagan level of potency, which is not so potent, and maybe even less so, because I think as society marches forward, the idea of revelation-based religion and literal, biblical literalism just necessarily you know, diminishes in credibility, doesn't it? I mean, I think even if you ask most people who identify as religious whether they truly believe that ancient men received special messages from God and wrote a book as a result, that they have a sense of identity with their Christian cultural upbringing, but they don't necessarily believe a lot of even the most basic concepts. I mean, 98% of Catholics use birth control, even though birth control is not just a sin, but it's a mortal sin in the Catholic Church. So, you know, how seriously are Americans really taking their religion? So the point of the book really is that there's a big secular demographic out there that's really been on the outside looking in, and if we can get our place at the table by asserting ourselves and moving forward as a movement. When I joined the AHA, I really had a sense that it was too much of a club and not enough of a movement, and that was a kind of a constant drum that I was beating. And I think in recent years it's really moved in the direction of a movement. And 10 years ago you didn't hear the word secular or the term secular movement, did you? But now you do, and that's a good thing. So that's basically what it's about. I'd be glad to answer any questions and chat about it any way you like.
What are some of the measures people are taking that are different from from the way you talk? I get the impression that people were doing next to nothing. But we're aware of the billboards that are put up around the country, and we have had speakers come and talk to us about writing editorials and writing letters to the editor and that sort of thing. But can you talk to us about measures that we could take as a group
Sure, and I'll talk about the movement generally, actually, and there's some things that are being done that are not so much the activism of local adult groups, but the first thing I like to point to is the Secular Student Alliance, which I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's the umbrella group of campus atheist humanist groups, and if there's any indicator of how the movement is growing, it's the Secular Student Alliance. Just 5 years ago, they had only about 3 dozen campus affiliates. And now, 5 years later, they have over 350, and they can't keep up with the demand. There's so much demand for student secular groups. And they're moving into high schools now, which is something that is really going to normalize secularity. When you see, the kid who's on the basketball team with you, or the kid who, is in the chorus with you, staying after school to go to an atheist club in the cafeteria, that really normalizes the secular worldview. So that's one thing. And what I would point out about the secular students, it's very interesting, is that I don't think secular students are really anything new. I think there's probably a few more of them now, percentage-wise, than there were decades ago. But the really interesting thing is that decades ago, like when I went to college back in the 80s, there were lots of atheists around the campus, but the atheist identity was really just incidental. It was not anything important. When you thought about your identity, you didn't think, atheist is one of the first things that you identified with. You were maybe liberal or socialist or libertarian or whatever, environmentalist or feminist. There are a lot of labels you might put on yourself before you'd even think about putting the atheist label as something important. But today, because of the overwhelming saturation of religious conservatism in public policy and around the country, secular students really see their secular identity as something they want to emphasize. It's like, if you're really appalled by their attacks on education, their attacks on the environment, their attacks on birth control and reproductive rights, what easier way and what more efficient way of saying so than, I'm an atheist. Oh, okay, we know where you stand. That it's really something that's a phenomenon of this decade, something that's really important, and I think it's going to remain important until the religious right is under control. So that's one thing that's very significant. But as far as other groups go, yes, advertising is very important. Lobbying now, with the Secular Coalition, it's something that the atheist community never did. We hired our first lobbyist back in 2005, and we've got a few down there now. And now, as you probably know from talking to Edwina, we're going into the local level and setting up state chapters, state affiliates, so that we can lobby at the state level. And it's really identity politics all the way. It's like we're going to have legislators having atheists and humanists knocking on their door now, saying, we're watching you. What are you doing? It's just something that never existed before.